Hi, everyone. Welcome and happy National Science Week. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, as well as to elders from other communities who may be with us today. My name's Peter Grenfell, and I'm the Education Officer at Darebin Creek Management Committee. My role is to work with schools and the local community to raise awareness of the importance of looking after our local creeks and wetlands. And thank you all so much for joining us today. It's National Science Week, and the theme this year is Innovations for the Future of Our Oceans. So froggies aren't very oceanic. They're not very salt water, I'm sure you know, but obviously our wetlands are joined to our creeks, joined to our rivers, joined to our oceans. So it's all linked. So it's all important. There are over 500 free webinars running this week around Australia. And to join, you can go to the Science Week website or their Instagram page. In Whittlesea, we're so lucky to have so many reserves, parks, and waterways to explore, appreciate, and protect. I live in Preston Reservoir, but I certainly get out into the Darebin Creek and all sorts of creeks and rivers in Whittlesea. So, but under lockdown, I've been exploring the creeks a lot more in the past few months, as I'm sure a lot of you have as well. And when I'm exploring the local creeks and wetlands, I love listening for frogs. And so we're going to learn more about frogs today. And I think you always learn more there's always something else to learn about frogs. And I think we'll all learn a bit more today. I'll be moderating our Froginar today. And I'd like to introduce Julia Cirillo from Merri Creek Management Committee. Julia is our local Water Watch coordinator and frog extraordinaire, who will be teaching us some fun froggy facts today. Thank you to the City of Whittlesea for making this event possible, in particular Edmund Lascaris. What we'll be talking about today, we'll be splitting the webinar into the presentation part for around 30 minutes and a question and answer part for the last 15 to 20 minutes. If you'd like to complete a brief online feedback form at the end, that would be great. We'll paste the link into the chat towards the end. If you like, you're welcome to have your Frog Census app at the ready to use along with the presentation. It's a great app, and Julia will be referring to that a bit. And on that meeting invitation, we sent you a link to a frog quiz. During Julia's presentation, listen out for some questions to the quiz questions. And over to you, Julia.
And yes, as Peter said, happy National Science Week. So there's still lots of events happening until the end of the week around Science Week. Just got my details there. I'm from the Merri Creek Management Committee. So like Peter, the Management Committee, we look after mainly the Merri Creek catchment, but we also do lots of different things in rivers and creeks around the City of Whittlesea, as does Peter as well. And Peter and I both go out to schools and talk about frogs and other important animals and plants around the creeks and what people can do to help look after them. And the Citizen Science Project we're talking about today is the Frog Census, but there's other citizen science projects that we run as well, including Water Watch. There's also involved in the iNaturalist app, litter counts as well, and birds. So there's lots of different things that you can be involved in, even if you're at home at the moment. So this is what we're going to go through for the next sort of half an hour, the amazing world of frogs. So I'm just going to start with a bit about frogs generally, and then we'll get into more specific details. So I'll talk about where frogs can be found in the City of Whittlesea, so you can go out yourselves and have a look, and also how to do it carefully. Why use the Melbourne Water Frog Census app? So we'll be talking about the app, and hopefully some of you have downloaded that so you can have a look. Actually, maybe Peter can show me the poll a bit later to see if people did actually say that they had used it or not. Yeah. We'll talk about an introduction to local frog species, so you'll get to know a little bit more about them and how to make your own garden frog friendly. So there'll be a little bit about that as well. And then we'll finish at 3 o'clock. Before, well, of course, we'll have some time for questions as well. So yeah, keep putting your questions in the chat if you have any, and Peter will gather them up. So I was going to tell you a few frog facts. Some of them you might know already. So frogs obviously are in the group of amphibians, and amphibians have been evolving for 400 million years. So these are the types of animals that have that change. They go through that change or metamorphosis from having gills when they're in the water to actually being on land. And they are a very diverse group of vertebrates, and I'm sure some of you know vertebrates are those animals that have a backbone. And there's quite a number of different vertebrates around the world. In Australia, we've only got frogs as our native amphibians. So we don't have that picture there. It doesn't look too good on the screen there, but that's a salamander. And there's other animals called caecilians and toads that are around the world. We don't actually have them in Australia. We have just our frogs are the only amphibians that we have that are native. And worldwide, there are over 6,700 frog species. So those people that are doing the frog quiz, that is a question on the frog quiz. So there's your answer. But unfortunately, as of 2019, a third of these are actually threatened. So they're either critically endangered, or vulnerable. Frogs are really, really important. The reason we want to keep them is not just to keep our biodiversity high. If we take them out of the ecosystem, it can result in things like insect plagues. So frogs play a really important part in keeping things in balance in the food chain. So all our frogs in Melbourne are actually carnivores. So some of you might know what carnivores means. And they basically, eat other animals, and it's mainly smaller insects, water bugs, flies, crickets, things like that. They don't rely on plants. So all of our frogs in Melbourne need live insects and water bugs, so aquatic insects and other animals to survive. So they play a very important part. If we remove them, every time we would breathe, if we didn't have frogs anymore in Melbourne, every time we would breathe, we'd probably be breathing in a mouthful of insects. So they play a really important part. So I just thought I'd do a little bit of classification. So I know I've got some science students in the audience today. So here's a bit of classification for your science class. We're going to classify the spotted marsh frog. So let's see how we go here. What's the first level? See if anyone knows what the first level is. So we go into domain, eukarya. And then obviously kingdom Animalia, because it is an animal kingdom. Frogs are obviously in the animal kingdom, not in the plant kingdom. Then we go to the phylum Chordata. Class Amphibia, so that's where Amphibia comes in, is in class. Then we go to order, which is Anura. Family, which is, I'm always terrible at pronouncing these, but Myobatracidae, probably sort of correct. The genus, which is Limnodynastes, such a beautiful name, which means literally Lord of the Marsh. Marsh meaning wet grass, that's where they like to live. And the species is Tasmaniensis. And then you've got an example there. And that frog, those that came in a bit earlier today, that was the frog that I was showing you. I actually have a live frog that when I do face-to-face education sessions at early childcare centres or schools or wherever else I go, I take him along. So that's him there. So there's a little bit of classification for those of you reliving it and those that are studying at the moment in science. What I wanted to just briefly mention was, I mentioned we don't have any toads in Melbourne. We don't have any native toads. And luckily so far, we don't have this guy. He hasn't actually managed to get a firm foothold yet in Melbourne, the cane toad. So these guys were actually introduced. They were actually originally brought in to control the cane toad beetle that we were getting in our sugar cane up in Queensland. So they were seen as a really good biological pest control, which didn't work very well. And the reason is, so these beetles, these cane beetles, actually live on top of the cane. If you've ever seen sugar cane, it can get quite to meters tall. And the beetle would live sort of up the top. Now, if you have a look at this, and this is a question on the frog quiz, actually, on the second page, I think, one of the questions asks, how can you tell where a frog lives by looking at its feet? So you can see the cane toad, it says here, it doesn't have any toe pads. He's got leathery webbing between the toes, but he doesn't actually have any sticky pads, so he can't climb. He's actually more of a ground dweller. So you could imagine if he's on the ground in the cane fields and the beetles are 2 meters up, there's no way he's going to be able to get them. So it didn't work as a biological control. The really other interesting things about this one, about the cane toad, you can see he's very toad-like, which we sort of characterise with really bumpy skin. He's got creamy yellow, reddish brown colours on his back, and he sort of looks very warty looking. He's got a really large gland behind his eardrum. So a lot of people ask me, can frogs hear? Yes, you can see he's actually got just behind his eye, like a flat round circle. That's actually his eardrum. And he can actually hear that, and I'll talk more about what they hear. But he's got this big gland behind there, which actually has a poison. So if animals try to eat this guy, they'll actually get either very sick or die. And if you try to pick up a cane toad, he can actually squirt that fluid quite a bit of a distance. So be careful if you ever go up to far north Queensland or Northern Territory and try and pick them up. So yes, we don't actually have any toads, but we do have them in Australia. And unfortunately, due to climate change and having warmer, milder winters in the southern part of Australia, these guys are starting to move down. But these are the frogs we do have in Melbourne. So we actually have 16 species of frogs that have been found in Greater Melbourne. And as you can see there, there's quite a few. And I'm going to be talking about probably half of them today. But you can see there's some little red sort of triangles. Those are the ones that are threatened. And one of them is in the City of Whittlesea that lives there. And we've also got one that's introduced as well, the Eastern dwarf tree frog, which is actually also called the banana box frog. So they're from Northern Australia as well. And they have actually naturalised in some areas. So why are frog species becoming endangered? Why are they starting to decline? So there's a number of different reasons. One of the first ones is loss of habitat. So unfortunately, we're putting in a lot of new developments, new housing, new roads. Sometimes we're extending or building extra things. And these areas may have been once areas where frogs lived. Frogs don't necessarily just have to live in a lake or a river or creek. Some of them like to live in a bit of wet grass. It doesn't have to be a huge, amazing forested area. So that's definitely one issue. The other issue is that when this habitat gets separated or habitat fragmentation. So we might have a river or a creek or a little wet area, grassy area that one frog population lives in, but then there's not another spot like that for half a kilometre or 2 or 3 kilometres away. And frogs actually need to, for the genetic diversity, they need to actually move around and interbreed with different populations. Otherwise, their genetic pool is too small and they're not very strong. And those of you that have studied genetics and biology will know quite a lot about that. So we really need populations to be able to move and have things like wildlife corridors, which a lot of local governments, councils and others are trying to do a lot more of. And that's why it is an important thing to, put in some frog ponds in your backyards if you can, because that can be a stopping over spot for frogs to move through. Another issue is herbicides and pesticides, things like that. People are using weed spray and things on their gardens. That can be a problem for frogs. Pollution as well. So a lot of us, if you're washing your car on your driveway, if you're using a lot of detergent, that stuff can go down your driveway into the stormwater drain in the gutters on the side of the road and end up in your local river or creek. And this detergent is really toxic for our frogs. Other things like herbicides, pesticides, litter, especially microplastics. We're hearing a lot about microplastics. Well, they can have a really big impact on frogs as well. So those types of pollutions that are around our areas can be a really big problem. I talked really quickly before about climatic variation. So due to global warming, climate change, we're having milder winters here and drier autumns and spring. And spring and autumn is the time that frogs in Melbourne actually breed, and they need water because the frogs and then what will happen is that they can't actually they need the water to actually then have the tadpoles. The tadpoles need water. The adult frogs don't always need water, but the tadpoles do. So if we're having different times of the year when we're not getting as much rain as usual, that means that our frogs might not be able to breed, so their population will shrink. The other issue is introduced fish. So you can see down the bottom there, I've got 2 pictures. The one on the left is a gambusia or a mosquito fish, and that's actually a fish a bit like a guppy. They're quite small. They are in a lot of our rivers and creeks, and they love to eat tadpoles and eggs of frogs. So that's a really big problem as well. So if you ever are swishing around in your local creek or lake and you come out with these guys, please don't put them back in. The ones on the right, though, are what we want. They're a good fish. They're actually one of our native fish. It's called a galaxius, and they occur naturally in the Darebin Creek, the Merri Creek, the Plenty River, the Yarra River, and a lot of our other rivers and creeks in Melbourne. You can see they do look similar to the mosquito fish, the gambusia, but they're much longer and thin, and they don't actually have the same fins. Like they don't have a fin on the top of their head, but they're small as well. Like the galaxius probably gets as big as your little finger, like an adult's little finger. They're not a really big fish, but they're the fish we want in our rivers and creeks, and not the mosquito fish. And the other big issue has been the chytrid fungus, which some of you might have heard about. So this is a fungus that's highly infectious to frog populations and internationally is a problem. So it's actually one of the reasons a lot of people ask me, oh, can I take frogs from, say, a wetland near my house, like at a park or a close reserve, and I've built a frog pond in my house, can I move the frogs there? The answer is no. It's illegal because of the chytrid fungus. So if we keep moving frog populations around by humans, not by them themselves, we'll actually be spreading things like the chytrid fungus. So please leave populations in the wild alone and build your own frog bog if you want frogs closer to you. And I'll talk more about that later. And of course, predators. So the other thing is dogs, cats, foxes. Those kinds of animals can also have a big problem. Frogs can be a big problem for frogs as well. So why and where do frogs call? So frogs, the best way for us to learn more about frogs is to listen to their calls. Now frogs call to attract a mate so that they can spawn and lay eggs. Okay, so the way that they attract each other is their frog call. So they don't look for each other. It's not about sight, it's about their call. And they call from all different sites depending on where they're likely to lay their eggs. So it's a really instinctual thing. Once it starts to rain, and you might have been out for a walk and after rain or before or after rain, and you might actually hear the frogs calling. And that's because they're actually getting ready to breed. They really, they instinctively know, there's a lot of water around, I can actually lay my eggs. The other thing is only the males call. So they're actually doing that to attract a mate. And that's key for us because what's actually happening, they call to attract a female. And we use the frog calls when we're doing the frog census. So if you want to participate and learn more about frogs, the best way is to actually hear the boys call. And that is actually much less invasive. We don't really want you guys to get out there and jump, splash around in local rivers and creeks looking for frogs, because that will stress out the frogs. And it's not very safe for you either, because you normally need to do that when it's raining, so it's not very safe. You might slip over. So the best thing is to stick to the walking path along your local river or creek or along a wetland, and actually listen to them from there. So what is the frog census? Some of you would have already seen that, the frog census, and downloaded the app. So it's a really great citizen science thing that you can be involved in. So what happens there is that you download the app, which you can see the menu on the left there, and you press the record button. And even if you don't know the names of the frogs that you're recording, the freshwater ecologists at Melbourne Water, which is where the calls will go once you submit, will actually identify them for you, and they'll actually put them on some maps. So you can actually see on that actual frog census screen there that the map function, you can have a look at and see where people have actually recorded their frog species. So it gives you a really good idea of, where are certain species, and where are the gaps in our knowledge, where perhaps should we be going to record frogs because we don't know where they are. It's a great thing because it increases all our knowledge of local frogs, and it helps us identify them, so it's a good way to learn a new skill. Via non-invasive means, so not having to, go and actually search for frogs. And it increases all our understanding of frog distributions. So where can I hear frogs in Whittlesea? So Peter and I put a really good list together here for you, so you can actually find them yourself. So Darebin Creek in the Porsche Park, Maserati Park area, from the Ring Road, right from up there in the north, right down to the Ring Road to Thomastown East Recreation Reserve. And of course, so that's a really good spot. And then north of there on the Findon Creek, so Findon Creek is a tributary of the Darebin Creek in sort of Epping North and further north. Up there around Findon Road, Anglers Drive, Epping, Pine Park up in Wollert, so that's even further north you can go. Plenty Gorge, the Morang wetlands or the Plenty Gorge parklands, actually next to LePage Homestead, there's a really nice big wetland that anytime I go there, pretty much most of the year I hear frogs. And pretty much anywhere, if you live near the Plenty River catchment anywhere, there's lots of frogs. Edgar's Creek, if you go to Epping North near Zenabar Park and even near the Northern Hospital, there's frogs. The public gardens in Lalor, which is not far from the Merry Creek, you can go, and Yanyin Reservoir, so that's sort of part of the Plenty River catchment as well. And as I mentioned, check out the Frog Census app on reports on the mapping for where frogs have been recorded. So what I did before this presentation is I actually downloaded some maps from the Frog Census to kind of show you. So this is actually the Edgars Creek. You can sort of see the Edgars Creek, the blue line through here along the Edgars Road, and this is actually in Thomastown. So you can see, some of you might have been to Zebel's farmhouse over here in Lalor. So you can see there's actually all these green dots. Someone's gone out with the Frog Census app and has actually recorded frogs and then submitted them. So you can see, this is just a still, I can't actually click on it, but in your app you can actually click and see a report. So you can see here in 2005, so we've had the Frog Census app for a while, you can see a growling grass frog, which is one of our rare and special species, was actually recorded here in this little reserve here off Sarissa Street in Lalor. So this is a really good tool to train yourself in what frogs might be around. And you can see not a lot, though, along the Edgars Creek itself. It looks like they're more in the reserves here and over at the City of Whittlesea Public Gardens, which does have a wetland system there. This is another map of the Darebin Creek. So this is the Porsche Park that I mentioned before. So we're just north of Findon Road. And you can actually see there's a few spots along here as well, and someone here has recorded a spotted marsh frog. So that's, my frog. The spotted marsh frog there is also occurring there. So that's good to see a few spots along there. But then this map, I love this map. So this is quite interesting because this is the Plenty River catchment. So compare it to the Edgars Creek, the first one I showed you, the first map, and then the second map was the Darebin Creek. Look at the Plenty River. So if you live in Mernda or Doreen or around not far from Yanyin Reservoir or even in South Morang or Mill Park even, if you're anywhere near the Plenty River catchment, so it doesn't necessarily mean to be right along the creek, but in the catchment, there are heaps of frogs. These big green things, they represent hundreds of people's recordings. So that means at least 100 different times someone's gone and recorded in this particular area, and I think that's probably the Plenty Gorge Park there. But look, even if you go further up north of Mernda, up here, or even on the Growling Frog Golf Course, there's actually lots of frogs that you can actually hear. So yeah, it's a really good tool to sort of see where they are. Just wanted to mention really quickly, before I start talking about frogs, I'm going to start talking about the actual frogs now, that there's a question on the quiz for those doing the quizzes about the life cycle of frogs. So frogs in Melbourne sort of follow this pattern, sort of 5 stages. So the female frog lays their eggs, might be floating on a raft of water, as this one is here. I think this is actually the pobblebonk frog's eggs. So the pobblebonk female lays them just on top of the surface of the water, and they're like a floating raft, sometimes up to thousands of eggs. Within about 10 days to a week, the eggs start hatching into tadpoles. So that will be when they're breathing through their gills. Then we next have them growing into froglets, or metamorphs is the other word we use. So that's when they start, actually their tail starts to shrink and they start to grow hind legs. Then as they continue to grow, they sprout front legs and their lungs develop. So they go from being an aquatic animal with gills to breathe oxygen into a terrestrial or land animal where, like us, they use lungs to breathe, and their tail will start to shrink. And then, of course, they become a fully formed adult. And then in spring or autumn, so some frogs will do autumn as well, they'll mate and the female will lay thousands of eggs again and the cycle will continue. So there's sort of those 5 stages of the life cycle. So let's actually start discovering the frogs of Whittlesea. Let's actually meet some of the frogs. So I'm actually going to play, I've actually got the Frog Census app, here on my phone, and hopefully you can hear it through the recording, and I'm sure Peter G will let me know if you can't hear it. I always go to the first screen on the app, so if you've got the app on your phone, you're muted, so I won't be able to hear it, so that's fine. Do get your phone or your tablet out if you've got an external one, a different one to watching me, and actually bring up the frog section, and you'll actually see all those frogs that we talked about, 16 different frogs. And there's actually a little audio button, so I'm actually going to play some of these frogs that are around Whittlesea. So the first one I wanted to show you was the one that you're most likely to hear pretty much anywhere, because they don't have a huge habitat requirement issue. They can pretty much, as soon as there's a bit of water, a puddle, some of them will breed. These are the Eastern Froglets, or common Eastern Froglets. They are very common. They are much more tolerant of different habitats, and they're very small. They're one of our smallest frogs, tiny, but they make the biggest noise. So you can see this picture clearly illustrates they have this membrane of skin underneath their mouth, and they actually can, by puffing it up, they can actually really echo the sound. So it makes them really loud for the females to actually find them. So let's actually play this. I'll play this one through here, but obviously all of you that are on mute, feel free to play yours at home as well. Can you all hear that one?
That was pretty good, I think, Julia. I could hear that quite clearly.
Oh, great. Wonderful. So
that was really good.
Oh, great. Thanks. So that's great. So you can hear that one really well through here. Great frog too. A lot of people, when they first hear it, think, oh, that's a cricket. I thought that was a cricket, but no, that's actually a frog. So that might be one that some of you have heard. Feel free to put in the chat. Yeah, I've heard that one. We'd be interested to know. Let's go on to the southern brown tree frog. Love this frog. Gorgeous little frog, creamy, very creamy colour on his belly and also on his back, and a little bit of white around his mouth. Now this one, again on your frog quiz, you can really see where he lives because he's got those sticky sort of toe discs. His fingers and toes have this sort of sticky round discs, I guess, so he can climb. So he doesn't just climb up trees and logs, he can actually climb up some of the shorter grasses around rivers and creeks. Now, and these guys actually, the females attach their egg mass to grasses and twigs, so it's sort of above the water because they climb, they don't live right in the water, and that helps protect their eggs from fish, like say the mosquito fish, for example, because they're not right in the water. So he's got a lovely call. I'm going to play this one for you as well. I really like this one. So you've got to go down to the tree frogs to hear this one. He's just beautiful, isn't he? I really love that one. It's a really nice sound to hear at night. I know some people are really lucky to live near where these frogs are calling. Another tree frog that's quite closely related, those interested in classification, you'll see the genus Litoria is the same as the southern brown tree frog. The whistling tree frog is in the same genus. So these are also have a really whistling sound. So I find it's a bit more high pitched, that the southern brown is a bit more raspy, but it does take a little bit of practice. So these guys again also have those toe discs. You can really see those toe discs, so you can see he's a climber. And these guys usually have a bit of a darker colour. Again, quite small, like the southern brown. They're probably only about the size of probably get the size of your little finger when they're fully grown. So you can see he's just a little bit sort of more high pitched, where this is a southern brown. So they're both high pitched, but the whistling's just a little bit more high pitched. Another tree frog is the Peron's tree frog. Now this one I've heard quite a lot around the Doreen Lorimer estate. And they seem to come out later, and so it's when it's dark. So if you're going out, say in the summer, listening to frogs, you've got to wait till it's really dark. They've actually also, we rediscovered one frog night I had down at the Elthington wetlands in Elthington. We actually heard them, and they hadn't actually been discovered there. Like there was no records on the frog census app, so it might have been about 10 years since they last heard down on the Yarra, on that part of the Yarra. So we reheard them again last year. So that was really exciting. So these guys have got a really interesting call. They're one of the larger tree frogs. They're probably twice as big as the whistling and brown tree frog. So let's have a listen to this one. So really strange call, isn't it? I'll play that one again, but it's really sort of, they call it the mad laughing frog. So really loud frog, really quite really distinctive call. And you can see he's got really big toe pads as well, sticky toe pads as well. So you can see he's definitely a tree frog. And he's got those amazing, that cross-shaped pupil. I think the next picture I've got really shows that pupil. If I can get to it. Yeah, see that beautiful pupil. He's got a cross in the middle of his pupil, which is really distinctive if you're lucky enough to get that close to them. But obviously with the Frog Census app, you don't need to. So one of our threatened frogs, and just a really awesome frog really, but they are slowly starting to make a comeback in some areas of Whittlesea, are the growling grass frog. Again, he's in the Litoria group as well. So more of a ground dwelling. So you can see he doesn't really have those sticky toe pads on him. He's more in wet grasses. He likes a lot of water. He actually we've found they need quite deep water, like quarries and things like that to actually breed. Oh, thank you for the love hearts. Who's ever put them on my screen? So I'll play you this one because he's got such a distinctive call. Just amazing, isn't it? First time I heard it, I actually thought it was a trail bike or something along the creek. So they're a really distinctive one. So we're really keen, the Frog Census app, and Peter and I are really keen to hear if you ever do hear any growling grass frogs. There's been one entry lately on the Merry Creek in the Fawkner area, but nowhere else really other than around Epping, for Epping North, but not a lot of spots. So we'd unless you're on the Plenty River catchment, there seems to be quite a few there, so we would really like to hear. And I know that actually Peter G can probably tell us too, there's a few spots along the Darebin Creek as well that they have been heard as well. So I'm going to finish off with the marsh frogs. So these are those Lord of the Marsh, the Limnodynastes, and the ones that you're more likely to actually hear and come across. So this is the frog that I showed some of you, that I have a live one of, that I showed some of you this morning, which, I mean, just as we started, which is the spotted marsh frog. Again, yeah, living in wet grass, really distinctive spots, but mine was quite dark. So they do, remember all these frogs do have colour variation. That's why listening to their calls is the best way to identify them rather than trying to find them. So listen to this guy. You'll have to really listen up because it's quite a very short, sharp call. They're not big, long, flowery ones like the other ones. So listen to this one. So it's only a short, sharp sort of, some people think it's like sort of pebbles falling on or two rocks hitting each other. It's just a really small, distinctive call. And I know I'm starting to run out of time, so I'm going to try and speed up a little bit. Couple to go. Striped marsh frog, again in the same genus, Limnodynastes, so very closely related to the spotted. So have a listen. Sounds sort of similar too. Some people think it sounds a bit like a chook, sort of bok, bok. So again, a really short, sharp one, that striped marsh frog. So they do sound quite similar, but the more you go out and listen, the easier they become to hear and sort of distinguish between them. And let's try and move on to my favourite. I want to get onto my favourite, the pobblebonk frog, also known as the banjo frog, because some people think it sounds like a banjo plucking strings. These guys live much more in the ground. They're big diggers. They love to dig. And they've got really strong arms, so you can see their legs and their arms, really muscular, because they love to dig in the ground. So they're probably the one that looks closest to toads for us. You can see they've sort of got that real sort of warty back, but they are not a toad, they're definitely a frog. And this guy's really distinctive, so there'll probably be a few of you that will know this one, and I noticed in the chat that people had already knew this one quite well too. So yeah, really beautiful one. So that's a really, really good one to remember. And probably some of you have already heard that one. We haven't got a lot of time today, unfortunately, to talk about habitat for frogs. It's really a whole another webinar, really. But we wanted to just tell you about some of the things that you can do to actually bring making your garden frog friendly. So some of the things that you can do, if you were thinking, I'd really like to introduce more frogs into my backyard, or you might have a little courtyard, this is one way that you can do it. So you can actually build a pond. Now, if you're going to build a pond, please make sure you don't put fish in the pond, because as we talked about, fish do like to eat tadpoles and eggs, so don't do that. Lots of logs, rocks, and local plants. You've got to have lots of areas for frogs. Some of them like to bask in the sunlight. So the growling grass frog, for example, likes to sunbake. So make sure you've got rocks and logs sticking out of the water a little bit so they can submerge, come in and out of the water when they want to, and use locally indigenous plants. Melbourne Water has actually got a really good frog-friendly habitat as an excellent guide that you can get online as well. And Costa, who does the Gardening Australia site website, actually has a great how to create a frog bog habitat. I'm glad you love frogs. Whoever wrote that over the top. How to create a frog bog habitat. And Bunnings has actually got instructions on building a frog hotel on their Instagram page. So that's a really good one to go to. We'll actually send after this presentation, we'll send you an email with all the links where you can go to get this information. So that's a really good thing to do. Make sure you have lots of shade. Exclude predators. So if you've got cats or dogs or chooks, make sure that they can't get in to the frog pond. Don't use any pesticides or herbicides into your garden, and don't wash if you're near a river or creek, or you've got your car near where your backyard might be, don't wash your car with detergents on your driveway, and frogs will find you. The closer you are to habitat already established, you'll get frogs coming much more quickly, but if sometimes it may take years. If you're much further away and there's been habitat fragmentation, it will take a lot longer. So you might just have to be patient. But they will find you. If you build the habitat, they will come. Here's an example. This is a frog habitat that my predecessor Jane helped build up in Whittlesea. Actually, it's actually next to the Whittlesea Library, next to the childcare centre, so anyone can go and have a look. And actually the plants are much more established now. This was put in about 5 years ago, but there are actually tadpoles in there. I went around for a library event last year and swished around, and we actually did find tadpoles. So this is a really good example. The other thing that's good to put on in your backyard, especially if you've got young children, is to put some mesh over the top for safety, obviously, so people don't fall in or accidentally step in it. And also excludes those predators, the cats and the dogs and the foxes and things as well. Yeah, I can see that Hans helped build this pond with the students of Whittlesea Secondary College. Thanks, Hans. Yeah, it's a fabulous pond. There's actually some really good, there's tadpole species in there, I think about 2 or 3.
There are a couple of the questions there, Julia. Are frogs shy?
Yes, I would say frogs are shy, so we really don't encourage people to go out purposely looking for them. So, don't put your gumboots on and splash right into a river or creek or a wetland, because that will disturb them quite a lot. Plus, they're quite small, so you can't always see, what you're stepping on. I nearly stepped on a spotted marsh frog once just on a bit of wet grass. So try and stick to the footpaths or the bike paths, the normal paths when you're going out trying to listen to the frogs.
Yep. Another question. You might have covered this, Julie, but what are the predators of frogs?
Oh, you know what? Everything eats frogs. So I mentioned the ones that are sort of human introduced, like cats and dogs and foxes and chooks, but there's also frogs eat each other. So the growling grass frog eats smaller frogs. Birds also eat frogs. Tiger snakes, actually any snake in Melbourne, like brown snakes and tiger snakes, they love frogs. Fish will eat frogs. Yeah, pretty much everything will eat frogs. Apparently they're quite tasty. some humans. So frogs have a lot of predators, which is why we need to help them, why we need to build their habitat so they've got some protection, because there's so many animals that eat them, which is one reason the females have adapted to, breed, have so many eggs, because usually most of those eggs will not make it to adult frogs because they'll get eaten.
Another question here. Do frogs bite or are they dangerous? I assume to humans that we mean there.
Yeah, no. I should say yes, they are, so then people will leave them alone. But no, no, frogs in Melbourne aren't dangerous. Of course, there's the poison dart arrow frog in South America, and I think there's a few other poison ones around the world, but we don't have any in Melbourne that are poisonous. The only one we really have is the cane toad, which isn't really in Melbourne, as I mentioned. It's sort of northern New South Wales and then further north. They have a poison gland, so if you were chasing or trying to pick up that frog, be very careful. But no, not in Melbourne.
There's a question, can you list endangered frogs? So I suppose we've already mentioned the growling grass frog.
Can you list them?
Yeah, I guess.
I did have a list before. So you've got, Bibron's toadlet, that's the other one, that's threatened. You've got the growling grass frog, that's threatened, and the southern toadlet. They're the 3 species in Melbourne that are threatened.
Another question, Julia. This is regarding the presentation. Are you able to share the presentations with a group? That came from a venturers group, a question from them. Are people able to look at your presentation? I guess that would
no, look, sorry, I don't pass it out because it's sort of my bread and butter, but I'm happy to come to groups and give presentations. So thanks to the City of Whittlesea and other council areas around Melbourne, we're provided with funding. Peter and myself, we both go out, don't we, Peter, and give this presentation. So we're more than happy if you email either Peter or I, and we'll send out our email addresses after this presentation. We can do it like this as a webinar at the moment, but we also take people out for walks and talks. So we're certainly happy to do that.
So about 3 more now. You might have answered this one too. I'm not sure. Are there no native toads in Australia?
No native toads. So they sometimes call them toadlets and things like that, but they're not actually toads. It's just a name. So again, that's why it's very important to look at the scientific name rather than a common name. So no, we don't have any.
One question here. Are perons native to the area? I guess that might mean the distribution of
Peron. Yeah. Peron's tree frog are a frog in Melbourne. So if you look on the app, if you download the app, if you go into the biological information, it has a map of distribution, so you can see where each frog occurs, and that'll give you a bit more information.
And pretty much, we might be running out of time. Maybe just a couple of more. It says, how fast can an average frog reproduce? I guess how often. An average frog.
Great question.
Might have to use an example.
Frogs aren't average. First of all, there's no such thing as an average frog. So most of them will breed in autumn and spring. Some will breed all year round. So I think like the Eastern Froglet will breed all year round. So it varies on the species. Again, if you want more information on this question, go into the app and go into each frog and go into its biological information. I'm pretty sure that question's covered there, like how often they breed. But most of them will breed in autumn and spring. And of course, it takes from a week to 2 weeks for the eggs to hatch. And then I guess in probably about 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, they'll be adults. But yeah, it varies between each species.
And Julie, that's about it. We're probably just about out of time. Might be worth, waving goodbye and.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Hope you enjoyed it.